What if the threat Moscow fears the most isn't NATO or some foreign power, but a force rising from inside of its own borders? Out in the cold stretch of Siberia, former Russian soldiers have taken up arms against the country they once defended. Now they're fighting under Ukraine's banner, carrying a name tied to a region Moscow has drained for generations. And here's the part that almost never makes it into the headlines. This battalion isn't focused on winning a few battles at the front. Their real goal points to something far larger, something that could reshape Russia's future in ways the Kremlin tries hard not to look at. So what pushed Siberians from loyal service to open rebellion? And what kind of outcome are they actually chasing? That is the journey we're stepping into. Let's go way back to where the story really begins. This is the Siberian Battalion, a force born from anger and held together by decades of frustration. They say Siberia has been mistreated, stripped, and sacrificed again and again. And now they decided to strike back. Right now, the Siberian Battalion is still relatively small, but the weight it carries is huge. No one outside the unit knows the exact number of fighters, though most estimates place them somewhere in the low hundreds. That might seem tiny next to the massive armies fighting across Ukraine. But their importance isn't measured in size, it's measured in efficiency. A well-trained, highly motivated group with deep knowledge of Russian tactics can apply far more pressure than a bigger force without direction. And that's exactly what's happening. Their value lies not in numbers, but in what their presence reveals about Moscow's growing problems at home. Under Ukraine's command, Russians from Siberia and the Far East volunteer, defect, or escape their own country to fight against it. Some slip across the border to hit military targets, while others focus on reconnaissance, sabotage, and urban missions. Each one of these actions forces Moscow to shift troops, rethink strategies, and face the global embarrassment of having its own citizens fighting on the opposite side of a war it calls a unification campaign. On top of their feats on the battlefield, the political signal they send is enormous. Moscow now labels them as terrorists, while Ukraine calls them liberators. The contrast grows sharper with every raid and every confirmed operation. Each mission, each report of a Siberian fighter clashing with Russian troops, exposes something deeper. Behind all those bold speeches, the cracks inside Russia stretch deeper than most people ever imagined. Inside Russia itself, the reaction to the battalion isn't nearly as simple as the Kremlin pretends. Some people shrug, repeating whatever state TV tells them. Others stay silent even when they quietly agree, knowing exactly what happens to anyone who steps out of line. In small online circles, people trade stories about missing relatives from heavily drafted regions. They wonder why so many of their young men were pulled from Siberia in the first place. None of these form a loud nationwide protest, but the quiet doubt carries its own kind of power. When a state survives by suppressing questions, even soft whispers can travel farther than the loudest rally. Now, to understand how this battalion came together and how it operates today, we have to look at why Siberians felt pushed all the way to armed resistance. That's the core of everything, and it begins with identity, history, and a long-standing feeling that no one in power really cared about them. For starters, Siberia is unbelievably vast, stretching from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. It is wide enough to swallow entire countries without trying, and it is 77% of the entirety of Russia. Thick forests stretch for thousands of kilometers, frozen rivers carve through the land, and lonely mountain ranges loom over scattered towns. On the map, the region looks rich and full of promise, but living there often feels like a constant struggle. Roads crumble into mud, hospitals run out of medicine, schools fight to stay open, and basic services vanish when you need them the most. These resources may be abundant, but the benefits never seem to go where they should. They flow straight to Moscow, while families back home scrape by. And that's a huge issue when you look at the numbers. Siberia produces around 80% of Russia's oil, 85% of its natural gas, most of its diamonds, and more than 40% of its timber. That is massive. Yet places like Tyumen, one of the richest regions in the entire country, send most of their tax revenue to Moscow and barely receive anything meaningful in return. Economists call this the Siberian curse, a land overflowing with wealth, but treated by the capital like a resource pit instead of a home for millions of people. For many Siberians, it feels like they matter only for what they can provide, not for who they are. And that sense of being used doesn't stop at economics. It flows straight into the war. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the burden fell heaviest on Siberia's minority groups. Buryats, Yakuts, Tuvans, Khakas, they were all drafted in staggering numbers. Many were rushed to the front with almost no training and barely any gear. Then came the scandal that quietly turned anger into raw fury. Reports confirmed what families had already suspected. Casualty rates among minority groups were far worse than in Moscow or St. Petersburg. In fact, the BBC reported that 6 of the 10 Russian regions with the highest mortality rates in the war are in Siberia. And when you add in the reports of Russia sending waves of poorly prepared soldiers into battle as meat units, the whole situation starts to look less like incompetence and more like policy. But the real explosion of outrage came from something even more disturbing. In 2022 and 2023, enlistment offices in Buryatia, Tuva, and Yakutia began bending the rules to meet mobilization targets. Registering men who were medically unfit, long absent, or even already deceased. Families opened their doors to summons for sons who had left the country years earlier. When they posted proof of these abuses online, officials threatened them with prison for discrediting the army. For countless families who had never cared much about politics, that moment shattered everything. It felt like their lives were worth less, like entire communities could be drained without anyone noticing. For them, the state wasn't just taking resources anymore, it was taking their sons. That kind of pain is not only economic, it reaches deep into identity. It is no surprise that many people from this region do not see themselves as Russians at all. Most identify only as Siberian. They are not confused about the lines the state draws between them and Moscow, and they don't pretend those differences don't exist, they embrace them. From the Yakut festival with its ancient prayers to the sun, to Buryat shamans who never fully gave in to Orthodox Christianity, the old traditions never disappeared. They were simply buried under decades of forced Russification. These lines in the sand and oppressive antics are exactly where the battalion's story begins, because these are the men who refuse to stay silent any longer. The fighters of the Siberian battalion are not ordinary volunteers. More than half are not ethnic Russians at all. They come from communities that have dealt with decades of being dismissed or ignored. Many grew up hearing how their parents or grandparents were used as frontline soldiers, and as their brothers go through the same thing, they see that nothing has changed. Walk into their base and you'll spot old Soviet banners written in Buryat or Yakut script hanging beside the Ukrainian flag. These are the same banners their grandfathers carried when Moscow pushed minority units into the deadliest fights to protect ethnic Russians. Keeping those banners up today isn't about nostalgia. It's a reminder of wounds that have never healed. That reminder becomes even sharper when you look at another dark chapter, the gulags. From the 1930s to the 1950s, millions of Soviet citizens were hauled east on the Trans-Siberian Railway to die in freezing labor camps. Indigenous Siberians watched their homeland turned into a giant prison yard. Forests, rivers, mountains, all of it worked to the bone by desperate inmates. So when the battalion hangs those banners beside Ukrainian flags, they're making a statement. They remember who paid the price for Moscow's empire. So you can see why this history is always close to their hearts, and why it fuels them. Siberia has long been treated like a colony inside of its own country for centuries, since the late 1500s, when the Cossack leader, Yermak Timofeyich, crossed the Urals and shattered the Sibir Khanate. Moscow followed, planting forts that grew into cities like Tyumen, Tomsk, and Krasnoyarsk. From the very beginning, Siberia was not conquered to be equal. It was conquered to be mined, used, and drained. First came furs and trade routes, then minerals and oil. The people who lived there, their ancestors, were pushed aside or turned into subjects of a distant power. Time didn't make things easier. During the Soviet era, Moscow built enormous industrial projects in the region. Mines, factories, power plants. They brought jobs, but they also brought pollution, hard labor, and forced population movements. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, many of those projects collapsed with it, leaving behind ghost towns and ruined buildings. The profits were long gone, siphoned west to Moscow decades earlier. The people stayed behind to deal with the ruins. For many young Siberians, it felt like their home was never seen as a real community, just a source of materials, or a dumping ground, pretty much whatever Moscow deemed it at the time. And under Putin, that pattern didn't change. It hardened. Local activists were silenced. Cultural groups were pushed aside or banned outright. Anyone who spoke openly about regional pride or autonomy risked arrest. Protests never got the chance to take shape. Elections were tightly controlled, and independent media barely survived. Over time, some people started to believe that peaceful efforts would never work. This began to brew anger in the background. But anger alone doesn't turn into an armed movement. Something else had to ignite it. That spark came when Russia invaded Ukraine. This is where everything snapped into place. Siberians watched their government demand loyalty once again, while sending them to fight in a war that had nothing to do with their lives, their land, or their future. Some fled mobilization, others escaped abroad, and some were already living outside of the country. A handful of them ended up in Ukraine or nearby places, unsure of what to do next. And then a choice appeared. If these men were going to risk their lives, they wanted that risk to carry weight. They didn't want to die for Moscow or for someone else's story about honor, or for promises that had never reached their villages. They wanted their fight to matter in a way that reached back to their own land, the place that shaped them. That simple shift in purpose is what pushed the Siberian Battalion into existence. It didn't come from random defectors drifting into Ukraine's lines. It grew out of a clear intention, something focused and steady, a shared understanding that they weren't just helping Ukraine, but trying to shape the future of Siberia itself. That mindset showed up immediately in the way they were recruited. They didn't want people who were angry for a week and then confused the next. Skill counted, but clarity counted even more. Leaders looked for volunteers who knew exactly why they were stepping into the fight. Men who would hold their resolve when fear hit, when bullets cracked overhead, and when the cost of the mission became painfully real. Those who made it didn't just join a unit. They joined a purpose that felt larger than themselves. As the battalion took shape, it naturally settled around a few stable figures who gave it structure. At the top was Vladislav Amosov, known to everyone as Yakut. He was the calm voice in chaos, the one who could make sense of a messy battlefield and give orders that kept men alive. He didn't raise his voice or try to impress anyone, yet people listened, because he stayed composed when others started to unravel. Working alongside Amosov was a small circle of activists who became the battalion's voice to the outside world. They handled interviews, explained the unit's mission, and managed relationships with Ukrainian partners who needed to understand what this force was trying to become. Supporting them from abroad was the Russian Civic Council in Poland, a network of exiles that took on the unglamorous but essential work: funding, logistics, gear, and political outreach. Without that backbone, no fighting unit survives beyond its first burst of enthusiasm. But the real backbone of the battalion was the network that almost nobody ever sees. Inside Russia itself, wives, sisters, and mothers became the lifeline. They were the ones who convinced draft-aged men to run before the state could grab them. They guided them across frozen rivers in winter on sputtering snowmobiles, and slipped them through lakes and streams in summer on shaky little boats that looked like they shouldn't even float. Those escape routes all led to the same place. Eventually, the men reached the battalion, and once they did, everything tightens as discipline takes over. The training is hard, shaped around real operations rather than big speeches. Fighters wake up with a clear chain of command, strict rules, and the understanding that every weakness inside the unit becomes a danger outside of it. This isn't a loose crowd of defectors burning with emotion. It is a group that spends every day trying to turn intention into capability. That sense of unity matters even more, because the battalion reflects the whole diversity of Siberia. Buryats, Yakuts, Tuvans, Khas, and others stand in the same lines. Their languages are spoken freely, their traditions are respected. Their beliefs, which Moscow spent years trying to flatten out, are given space instead of being treated like an inconvenience. To many of them, preserving their identity is part of that fight. The battalion didn't just give them a uniform. It gave them a place where they could be themselves fully without apology. Their structure grew even stronger once they opened their own prisoner swap channel. More than 40 fighters have returned through quiet deals, along with dozens of Ukrainian POWs who happen to be Buryat or Yakut. When one of these men comes back, he records a short message in his own language while wearing a Ukrainian uniform. Those videos race through chat groups in Siberia, spreading faster than anything the state can censor. One clip can pull in more volunteers than any speech Yakut or Perenkov could ever give. All of this turned the battalion into something that went beyond the battlefield. For men who felt invisible for most of their lives, this unit became a place where they felt seen and valued. That sense of belonging didn't just lift their morale. It carried them straight into the fight with a clarity that surprised even their allies. From the beginning, their goals were bold. They weren't fighting for Ukraine in the same way as other foreign volunteers do. Their mission ran deeper and more personal. They wanted to weaken Moscow's grip and open the door for a future where Siberia could speak for itself. Some dream of autonomy with real control over resources, culture, and political decisions. Others imagine full independence. They don't all share the same end game, but they share the same belief that Moscow's power is not a natural force of nature. It is something that can be challenged, pressured, and eventually reshaped. Once the battalion formed, things moved quickly. Training shifted into real missions. And those missions were chosen with precision. They picked targets that mattered, places where Russian forces felt safe and predictable. They gathered intelligence with surprising speed, using their understanding of Russian military routines to strike exactly where the Kremlin expected the least resistance. Outside observers realized almost instantly that this wasn't a group of frustrated defectors. It was a sharp, disciplined unit that understood the system it was fighting against because it had once been a part of that system. Back inside Russia, fear spread even faster than the battalion's operations. The FSB started hunting shadows as officials convinced themselves that some fighters never actually left the country. They imagined them slipping back into their villages and working as sleeper cells. There is no proof of this, but proof has never really mattered. Every time a recruitment office burns or a transformer station blows in Buryatia, local leaders whisper that the ones who came back are responsible. Whether the stories are true or not is irrelevant. The fear is real enough to freeze entire districts. And that shift from simmering resentment to armed defiance shows just how fragile a state becomes when its authority is built on intimidation. All it takes is the right moment, meeting the right people, and suddenly even a distant land like Siberia can send tremors across the entire Federation. What started as a spark has spread in ways no one expected. And it's not just Moscow and Kyiv watching. There is a third player that few in Moscow like to mention: China. Since 2023, Chinese companies have expanded their footprint across the Russian Far East, investing in timber, agriculture, and mining projects that feed directly into local economies. Beijing isn't choosing sides yet, but it's making sure that if Siberia ever gains more room to breathe, the first call for trade and investment will go east, not west. And the stakes are enormous. If the battalion succeeds, even slightly, the consequences could spread across Russia. Regional confidence could grow. Military loyalty could crumble. The image of a stable, united country could crack in ways the Kremlin cannot control. This is more than a fight over land or borders. It is a direct challenge to the system that has ruled Siberia for generations. And for the first time, that system is being forced to look over its shoulder. The Siberian battalion story cuts into the very core of the Kremlin's power. Siberia has always been the engine of the Russian economy. The oil fields, the gas pipelines, the metal mines, the forests. Without them, Moscow's wealth collapses. That is why even a whisper of separatism terrifies the Kremlin. Russians fighting Russia don't just break the narrative, they break the illusion of unity that the entire state depends on. If Moscow cannot hold loyalty inside of its own borders, how can it claim influence anywhere else? This anxiety from the Kremlin shows through its tone. State media labels these fighters as traitors and terrorists. Talk shows mock them while avoiding any real details. Yet behind the shouting, you can feel the unease. Troops are shifting. Border zones are tightening. Intelligence agencies are scanning for signs of unrest in places they once ignored. The fear deepens because these fighters know the country's internal machinery. They know weak points. They know how the infrastructure is guarded. They know who is loyal out of fear and who is loyal out of habit. The irony is heavy, really. The same people who once protected Russia's systems now understand exactly how to pressure them. They also know the opposition isn't perfectly united. Anti-Kremlin groups clash over leadership, funding, and tactics. Some want central coordination, others avoid it. A few compete for recognition. By keeping its mission narrow and its communications tight, the Siberian battalion has avoided the infighting that weakens so many movements. It is one of the few groups that has stayed focused while others get lost in arguments. The resentment feeding this moment has been building for years. In 2012, protesters in Novosibirsk carried signs saying, "Stop feeding Moscow." Artists unveiled a green and white flag for a United States of Siberia, causing national outrage. Shirts saying, "I am Siberian," sold out everywhere. When protesters shouted, "Power to the millions, not the millionaires," in 2017, the Kremlin responded with new laws, raids, and sentences meant to scare the region back into silence. But every arrest turned more people against the system. Moscow had no idea that the anger it tried to crush would one day feed a battalion beyond its reach. And Siberians are not alone. Across Russia, small resistance groups are forming. The Freedom of Russia Legion, the Russian Volunteer Corps, Chechen fighters in exile, Tatar and Bashkir units, like the Ida Rural Legion and the Bashkortostan Battalion. They train beside the Siberians. They share intelligence. Their videos race through underground channels, reaching millions of people who once believed they were alone. All of them connect through the Forum of Free Peoples of Post-Russia, a loose alliance of exiled leaders meeting in Poland and Lithuania. They trade information, sketch out future borders, and quietly prepare for the day when regional councils might break away. No one expects a sudden collapse, but every handshake between a Buryat fighter and a Tatar activist chips away at the old myth that Russia is naturally unified. And this isn't just Siberia's indigenous groups who are thinking about freedom. That spark has spread far beyond the eastern steppes, reaching places Moscow hoped would never wake up again. What started as quiet frustration in one region has turned into a chain reaction across the entire map. And for Putin, it is turning into a nightmare he can't easily contain. You can see the first signs of this when you look south towards the North Caucasus. The memory of the Chechen Wars hangs over that region like a storm cloud that never leaves. In the 1990s and the early 2000s, Chechnya fought two brutal wars to break away from Russia. Moscow eventually crushed those rebellions. But the wounds never healed. Families still talk about sons who never came home, villages that were wiped off the map, and promises of autonomy that were quietly taken back. The pain didn't disappear. It settled into the walls and passed from one generation to the next. Move a little west into Dagestan and Ingushetia, and the anger looks different but comes from the same place. These regions mix ethnic pride with strong religious identity, and that combination makes them stand apart from Moscow in ways the Kremlin has never understood. People there always felt closer to their own traditions rather than the orders coming from the distant capital. The tension is quiet most days, but it never really goes away. All it needs is the right moment to rise again. Travel north to the Volga region, and you'll find a completely different chapter of resistance. Tatarstan once declared sovereignty in 1990, forcing Moscow into signing a special treaty that gave it more autonomy than almost any other part of the country. Later, that deal was stripped away piece by piece. But the memory of standing up to Moscow never faded. Tatars hold tightly to their language, their culture, and their history. Nationalist groups still push for recognition, knowing exactly what it felt like when their region once had its own voice. Right next door is Bashkortostan, which has been growing restless too. Recent protests over land rights and environmental issues might seem small on the surface, but underneath them lies something much larger. Many Bashkirs feel that they have been losing control over their own future, and every demonstration is a way of reminding Moscow that they have not forgotten who they are or what they want. Then there is Kaliningrad, sitting all alone in Russia's western edge. This region is an odd piece of the puzzle, cut off from the rest of the country and surrounded entirely by European Union states. Because of that, many people there naturally look westward. Their markets, their culture, even their conversations feel closer to Poland and Lithuania than to Moscow. Some activists openly talk about turning Kaliningrad into a new Baltic republic, tied more to Europe than to Russia. It may sound bold, but geography makes the idea hard to ignore. Even near St. Petersburg, separatist voices have started to stir. The Free Ingria movement points to a long history and a distinct cultural identity that survived centuries of empire and turmoil. Supporters say Ingria has its own rhythm, its own traditions, and its own way of seeing the world. Farther south in the Kuban region, Cossack groups echo a similar spirit. They see themselves as descendants of a proud warrior culture, and they don't forget that their ancestors fought for freedom long before Moscow absorbed them into the Russian state. And if you turn your eyes east once again, you reach the Urals, where the idea of a rural republic once flickered to life in the 1990s. Moscow shut it down quickly, but the symbols of that movement still appear at protests today. People in Yekaterinburg and across the region often speak about the Urals with a sense of pride that feels separate from the rest of the country. For them, this isn't just another province. It is a region with its own strength and its own claim to a different future. When you put all of these movements together, a clearer picture starts to form. Each one is small when viewed alone, but together, they stretch across Russia like a chain of unanswered questions. They reveal something the Kremlin hates to admit. Russia is not a single unified nation. It is a patchwork of peoples, cultures, and histories, held together by a center that never fully understood them. Now that patchwork is fraying at the edges, and every protest, every revived tradition, every battalion fighting under a different flag pulls the threads a little looser. For Putin, this isn't just a political problem. It is a sign that the empire he spent years trying to rebuild is shaking from within. None of these individual groups can topple Moscow on their own, but together they paint a picture of a country that is angry, exhausted, and drifting away from the center. What used to be isolated pockets of frustration have now become a pattern that even the Kremlin can't ignore. The consequences reach far beyond Russia's borders. For Ukraine, the Siberian Battalion is both a symbol and a strategic advantage. Their operations force Russia to spread its resources thinner and defend deeper inside of its own territory. In Europe, any hint or fractures inside Russia changes how governments prepare for energy shortages and security risks. China watches because instability in Siberia could disrupt long-term resource agreements. And the United States, even when silent, understands that internal cracks inside a nuclear state can shift global power far faster than battlefield victories ever could. The information war runs right beside the real one. Rumors about foreign funding, smuggling lines, or hidden agendas swirl with every mission. Moscow tries to bury the truth in noise, but the battalion's very existence disrupts a simple narrative the Kremlin depends on. Their story forces people to rethink what loyalty means inside Russia, and what it takes for ordinary men to finally challenge a system that has treated them like shadows for generations. And that brings us to the hardest part of all. What comes next? Siberia's future isn't a single road stretching in a straight line. It branches out in several directions, and each path depends on pressure from Moscow, the timing of events on the battlefield, and the strength of the people willing to push for change. One route leads straight to harsher repression, another opens the door to autonomy, and the boldest one walks right towards independence. And every one of these outcomes touches more than the battalion. They shape the lives of millions of Siberians, and quietly shift the expectations of every country watching from a distance. The first path is the one that Moscow knows best. It's the old playbook, basically crush the movement before it spreads. Arrest the organizers, silence the supporters, and flood the region with security forces until the atmosphere itself feels heavy. Under this scenario, daily life would become increasingly tense until even a private conversation could feel risky. More cameras, more checkpoints, more fear. Siberia's wealth would stay in Moscow's hands, but at a cost. The resentment would run deeper than ever. People might stay quiet for a while, but that silence would be loaded with anger. And history has shown something important. Repression can pause a movement, but it rarely kills the idea behind it. The idea continues to simmer quietly until the right moment comes again. The second path feels uncertain, but also carries real hope: autonomy. If the war drains Russia long enough, Moscow might decide that loosening its grip is better than losing everything. In that case, Siberians could gain more control over their budgets, cultural policies, languages, and local development. Imagine regions finally getting to fix their own roads, fund their own schools, and modernize their own hospitals, instead of waiting for a distant capital that never moves fast enough. Even limited autonomy would send shockwaves across the country. It would show that Moscow's authority is not as absolute as it claims. For Siberians, it would feel like breathing freely after years of pressure. For the Kremlin, it would be a quiet admission that even a superpower has its limits. And then there's the path that almost no one talks about openly, even though many think about it constantly: full independence. If Russia continues to stumble and other regions begin questioning their loyalty, Siberia could move towards a complete break. An independent Siberia would immediately become one of the largest countries on Earth by land area. It would inherit massive natural resources, major rivers, ports, and railways. And here's the path that would make Moscow sweat. China has already studied this scenario for years. If this separation happens, China might be one of the first countries to recognize a new Siberian state, because China stands to benefit from the stability and trade opportunities that would follow. Life for ordinary people would shift as forgotten towns finally receive investment. Indigenous cultures could return to public life without fear. Local leaders would shape their own identity without waiting for Moscow's approval. The risks would be real, but the chance to build a new nation from the ground up would be just as real. And when you picture it, even for a moment, the idea becomes almost impossible to ignore. A country stretching from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. A land with more natural wealth per person than almost anywhere else on the planet. Cities like Novosibirsk, Krasnoyarsk, and Yakutsk rising as regional hubs with influence far beyond Russia's borders. Schools teaching local languages proudly instead of hiding them. Trade routes and pipelines finally designed to benefit the people who live there, not officials thousands of kilometers away. A nation free to choose whether it sees itself as Asian, Arctic, Eurasian, or something entirely new. This is the vision that gives those fighters strength on long nights when the war feels endless. But whichever path Siberia chooses, the impact won't stay inside of its own borders. The Kremlin's confidence, its military posture, and its claim to national unity would all take a hit. Another region would watch closely and ask whether they might be next. And foreign governments would adjust their strategies as energy supplies, alliances, and security plans shift around whatever Siberia becomes. But there's also a darker possibility that the battalion prefers not to dwell on, even though they know it is real. If the unit collapses, If its leaders fall, or if internal tensions tear it apart, the consequences would be severe. Moscow would jump at the chance to declare victory. It would broadcast to the entire country that resistance is pointless and suicidal. Crackdowns would intensify, activists would be hunted, and any spark of rebellion would be stamped out harder than before. The battalion's survival isn't just about surviving the war. It is the slim shield protecting the hope of freedom for millions who feel abandoned by Moscow. At this moment, everything hangs on whatever happens across that vast frozen frontier. The battalion may be small, but they've already shattered the illusion that loyalty inside Russia is unbreakable. By fighting for their own future, they open a door that Moscow never meant to unlock. And once a door like that opens, it rarely closes cleanly again. Their mission has grown far beyond them. It has become a question about the future of a region that carried Russia on its back for generations, and may finally be ready to stand on its own terms. So when someone asks why Siberians are fighting to defeat Russia, the answer comes down to one truth. They believe Moscow stole their future. Their land was drained for profit. Their identity was pushed aside. Their resources were taken to build someone else's life. This war gave them something unexpected, a chance to take that future back. They're not fighting only for Ukraine. They're fighting for a world where their culture, their rights, and their choices finally matter. The Siberian Battalion is more than a military unit. It is a signal that cracks are forming in the empire. Every raid they carry out weakens Moscow's claim of national unity. Every message they send home reminds people that loyalty is earned. It cannot be forced forever. They prove that resistance can grow even in the coldest corners of an empire that believed it was untouchable. And as the sun drops behind the endless forests and frozen rivers, the land may look still, but something is moving beneath the surface. Ideas are spreading. Frustration is turning into purpose. The impossible is starting to feel closer. If this moment becomes a real turning point, history may look back at these men not just as soldiers in a foreign war, but as the spark that lifted Siberia out of the shadows and forced Russia to face a future it never wanted to see. The world is waiting to see how far that spark will travel.